Clara Johnson stood at the counter of Johnson Banking Group, Westfield branch, waiting. Her fingers tapped lightly against the cool marble, the rhythmic sound filling the otherwise quiet space. She had expected this to be a routine withdrawal, something that would take no more than a few minutes. Instead, Natalie Parker, the young teller, had hesitated. There had been a shift in her demeanor, small but unmistakable. The moment she saw Clara's ID and the withdrawal amount, her expression changed. Now Natalie had disappeared into the back office, taking Clara's identification with her. Clara let out a quiet sigh, adjusting the sleeves of her cardigan. She had been patient. She knew what was coming, even before it happened. She had seen it too many times before. A woman like her, black, casually dressed, making a large withdrawal, it wasn't hard to guess what assumptions were being made behind that frosted glass door. The minutes stretched on. 2, 5, 7. Clara shifted her weight slightly, keeping her expression neutral, but inside her frustration simmered. She had opened this very branch. She had stood right here on grand opening day, smiling for pictures, cutting the ribbon. And now she was being treated as if she didn't belong. The door to the back office finally swung open, but Natalie wasn't alone. Eric Simmons, the branch manager, followed close behind, holding Clara's ID in one hand. His suit was neatly pressed, his hair combed back, his expression unreadable, except for the hint of something behind his eyes. Clara knew that look all too well. Skepticism, suspicion, doubt. "Good afternoon, Miss Johnson," Eric said, offering a forced smile. He glanced at the clipboard in front of him, as if double-checking the details of her request. "I understand you're looking to withdraw $5,000. Clara nodded. "Yes, from my personal account. Everything should be in order." Eric didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held her ID up to the light, turning it slightly, examining it like it was a fake. Clara's patience thinned. She had been here before. Not here physically, but in situations just like this, she knew what was happening. This wasn't about bank policy. This was about assumptions. "Can I ask what you do for work, Ms. Johnson?" Eric asked smoothly, still looking at her ID. Clara stilled. It was an innocent-sounding question, but the weight behind it, the meaning, was far from innocent. She had already provided identification. She had already been a customer for years. This wasn't about verifying her account. This was about proving she deserved to be here. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her tone even. "I run a bank," she said. Eric finally looked up. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh? Which one?" Clara exhaled slowly, keeping her frustration in check. "This one," she said. "I own Johnson Banking Group. I founded it. I built it." Silence. For the first time, Eric's expression faltered. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Natalie shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the computer screen. The air in the room changed. Clara let the moment stretch. She wanted them to feel it, the weight of what had just been said. Then finally Eric found his voice again. "Well, that's impressive," he said, though his tone was too polished, too careful. He cleared his throat, glancing at the form again. "And just to confirm, this is a personal withdrawal, correct? Not a business transaction?" Clara felt her patience snap. "I've already said that," she replied, her voice now firm. Eric hesitated. "Well, you understand, Miss Johnson, that we have certain security procedures in place." Clara's gaze hardened. "Security procedures?" she repeated. Her voice carried across the lobby. Heads turned. A few customers at the waiting area glanced over. "I've given you a valid ID," she continued. "I've been a customer here since this branch opened. And yet, I'm being treated like I'm trying to steal from my own account." Natalie's fingers froze over the keyboard. Eric's jaw tensed. "That's not what we're implying," and he said quickly. Clara didn't let him finish. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the next words land like a hammer. "Tell me, Mr. Simmons," she said, "if I were a different person, dressed in a business suit, would you be making me jump through these same hoops?" Silence. Eric's mouth opened, but no words came out, because they both knew the answer. Clara let the tension linger. Then she straightened, reaching into her bag. She pulled out her phone and held it up. "If this withdrawal doesn't get processed in the next 2 minutes," she said calmly, I'll be sending an official complaint to my executive team, and I'll make sure corporate sees exactly how customers are being treated at this branch. Eric paled. Natalie swallowed hard. The power had shifted, and they felt it. A beat of silence passed. Then, Ms. Johnson, of course, Eric said hurriedly. I'll process the transaction immediately. He turned to Natalie. Get it done, he said stiffly. Natalie's fingers flew over the keyboard. Within moments, the transaction was approved. The printer whirred, spitting out the receipt. Clara took it without a word. Then slowly she picked up her ID and slid it into her wallet. Before turning to leave, she let her gaze linger on Eric one last time. You should remember who I am next time, she said. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked out of the bank. As the automatic doors whooshed shut behind her, she didn't need to look back to know things at Johnson Banking Group were about to change. Clara Johnson watched as Natalie Parker emerged from the back office, her face carefully blank. But Clara's gaze sharpened when she saw she wasn't alone. Eric Simmons, the branch manager, followed closely behind, holding Clara's ID in one hand like it was a counterfeit bill. His stiff smile was the kind that carried more condescension than courtesy. Good afternoon, Ms. Johnson, Eric said, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. I understand you're making a withdrawal. Clara crossed her arms. Yes, she said, $5,000 from my personal account. Eric hesitated. His eyes flicked down to her ID, then back up to her face. May I take another look at your ID? He asked. Clara's jaw tightened. She had already handed it over. Natalie had already checked it. And yet, here he was, treating her like she was a suspect, not a customer. I already gave it to Natalie, she said, her voice steady but firm. Eric didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, he held the ID up to the light, tilting it at different angles, as if expecting it to reveal some hidden sign of fraud. Clara had seen this before. The silent accusations, the doubt, the need to verify beyond reason. It wasn't about security. It was about who they thought she was, or rather, who they thought she wasn't. A flicker of irritation ran through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. After a pause, Eric lowered the ID. His next question made her stomach tighten. What do you do for work, Ms. Johnson? Clara's patience thinned. Why did it matter? Did they ask every customer withdrawing money about their job? She took a measured breath, keeping her voice sharp but controlled. I run a bank. Eric's eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh, which one? Clara held his gaze. This one, she said. I own Johnson Banking Group. The lobby went silent. Natalie's fingers froze over the keyboard. Eric blinked once, then twice. For a split second, his mask slipped, just enough for Clara to see it. The panic. But just as quickly, he recovered, clearing his throat. Well, he said, still avoiding eye contact, I just need to confirm whether this is a personal or business account. Clara's voice turned icy. It's right there on the form, she said. Eric turned her ID over in his hands, deliberately stalling. Clara's frustration deepened. She had been a customer here since the branch opened. She had personally approved the hiring of every employee in this building, including Eric Simmons himself. And yet, here she was, being treated like she didn't belong. The usual hum of the bank had faded. Customers at the nearby counters had paused their conversations, sensing the undercurrent of tension. Eric glanced at Natalie, then back at Clara. Ms. Johnson, he said, I'll need to ask you a few more questions before we can proceed with the transaction. Clara's stomach turned. His tone, smooth but too carefully measured, made something prickle at the back of her neck. Then he asked it, and just to clarify, this is your first time banking with us, correct? The words hit like a slap. Clara stilled. This wasn't a new branch. She had signed off on every detail of its opening. She had stood right here, cutting the ribbon, shaking hands, smiling for press photos. She had built this place from nothing. And yet, Eric Simmons was looking her in the eye and asking if this was her first time banking here. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was an assumption, a deep, ugly assumption that people like her couldn't possibly own something like this. Clara's fingers tightened against the counter. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay measured. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. I've banked here since the day this branch opened. Eric's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flicked to Natalie, then back to Clara. He was weighing his options now, trying to decide how much further he could push this before it backfired. Clara watched him carefully. She could feel the moment tipping, and then he spoke again. "And you said you were withdrawing $5,000, correct?" His tone was slow, deliberate, as if the amount itself needed to be justified. Clara's patience snapped. Her eyes locked onto his. "Yes," she said. "Is that a problem?" Eric hesitated. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "for larger withdrawals, we sometimes require additional verification." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Do you?" she asked. Eric hesitated again. That was the mistake, because Clara knew bank policy better than anyone in this building, and she knew that what he was doing wasn't policy, it was discrimination. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to dig his own grave. So she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and held it up. "If this withdrawal isn't processed in the next 2 minutes," she said, her voice calm but deadly, "I'll be sending an official complaint to my executive team. And I'll make sure corporate sees exactly how customers are being treated at this branch." The blood drained from Eric's face. Natalie swallowed hard. The power had shifted, and they knew it. A beat of silence stretched. Then, "Ms. Johnson, of course," Eric said hurriedly. "I'll process the transaction immediately." He turned to Natalie. "Get it done," he said stiffly. Natalie's fingers flew over the keyboard. Within moments, the transaction was approved. Clara took the receipt without a word. She slid her ID back into her wallet. Then, before turning to leave, she let her gaze linger on Eric one last time. "You should remember who I am next time," she said. And with that, she walked out of the bank, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. Clara Johnson's fingers curled into a fist at her side, her nails pressing into her palm as she took a slow, steady breath. This was no longer about a withdrawal. It was about something else entirely. She had stated it plainly. She had banked here since the branch opened. She had built this place. And yet Eric Simmons still looked at her as if she were a stranger in her own institution. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked over to Natalie Parker, who shifted nervously but said nothing. The silence stretched as if they were conspiring over how to handle her. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Eric spoke again. "And you said you were withdrawing $5,000, correct?" His voice was slow, deliberate, as if the amount itself needed to be justified. Clara's patience thinned. She had provided ID. She had filled out the paperwork. She had answered their questions. But it was never enough. Eric tilted his head slightly. "Can you tell me what you do for work, Miss Johnson?" Clara stilled. Her stomach tightened, not from nerves, but from pure frustration. Why did that matter? She had already told him. He had her ID in his hand. She exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I run a bank," she repeated. Eric nodded slightly, but his expression didn't change. "And what kind of bank?" Clara's jaw clenched. There it was, the subtle, condescending doubt, the kind of question that wasn't about policy, it was about power. Clara took a slow breath, forcing her voice to remain calm, firm. "I own this bank," she said. "I founded Johnson Banking Group." Silence. Eric's fingers stilled against the counter. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped, just enough for Clara to see the surprise flash across his face. But he quickly recovered, clearing his throat and shifting his stance. "I see," he said slowly. Though Clara knew he hadn't really heard her, he glanced at the withdrawal slip, then back at her. "Is this a personal account or a business account?" Clara's patience snapped. She had answered this question already. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "It's a personal account," she said, her voice controlled but sharp. "The form is right there. My ID is right in front of you. What's the problem, Eric?" Natalie's hands froze over the keyboard, her face pale with discomfort. Eric, however, was still stalling. He didn't look at her when he replied. "No problem at all," he said, too smoothly, still pretending to study the form. But Clara knew better. He wasn't looking for mistakes. He was looking for a reason to deny her, a reason to make her prove she belonged here. And she was done playing along. Clara straightened, tilting her head slightly. "You seem hesitant," she said, her voice cool but commanding. Eric blinked, caught off guard. "Hesitant?" he echoed, feigning confusion. Clara didn't let up. "Yes," she said, stepping forward slightly. "It's been 15 minutes and I still don't have my withdrawal." Eric's mouth opened, then closed. Clara could see it, the realization setting in. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't afraid to call this out. A few customers in the lobby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. A man waiting near the teller's counter glanced between Clara and Eric, his eyes narrowing as if picking up on the situation. Even the security guard near the entrance had subtly straightened his posture, clearly tuned in. Eric cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the moment. "I just want to be sure everything is in order," he said, his smile tight, rehearsed. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Really?" she asked, her tone unwavering. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone and held it up. "Well then, let's get this all on record, shall we?" The shift in the energy was immediate. Natalie sucked in a sharp breath. Eric's posture stiffened. The bank lobby, already quiet, became dead silent. Clara didn't blink. "If this withdrawal isn't processed in the next 2 minutes," she said, her voice calm but deadly, "I'll be sending an official complaint to my executive team. And I'll make sure corporate sees exactly how customers are being treated at this branch." Eric went pale. Natalie's fingers flew over the keyboard. Eric turned back to Clara, his fake politeness finally cracking. "Ms. Johnson, that won't be necessary," he said quickly. Clara held his gaze. "Then process my transaction," she said. A beat of silence stretched. Then, Eric nodded stiffly. "Of course," he said. "I'll handle it personally." Natalie handed him the printed receipt with shaking hands. Eric barely met Clara's gaze as he slid it across the counter. Clara took it without a word. She slipped her ID back into her wallet, adjusted her cardigan, and turned to leave. But before she walked away, she let her gaze linger on Eric one last time. "You should remember who I am next time," she said. And with that, she strode toward the exit, her steps unhurried, unshaken. As the automatic doors whooshed shut behind her, she didn't need to look back to know. Things at Johnson Banking Group were about to change. Clara Johnson took a slow breath, steadying herself. This was not about security. This was about power. She had given them everything, her ID, her account number, her form, and yet Eric Simmons still sat there, flipping the paper in his hands, stalling. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Eric cleared his throat, still holding the clipboard as if it contained some secret flaw only he could decipher. "We take security very seriously," he said, his voice rehearsed, too smooth. "It's just a precaution." Clara's fingers curled against the edge of the counter. A precaution. She let the words sit there for a moment, letting the tension in the air settle. Then she lifted her chin slightly. "A precaution," she echoed, her voice cool, deliberate. "What exactly are you trying to say here, Eric?" Eric didn't answer. Instead, he reached for another clipboard, this time pushing it across the counter with a pen. "It's just policy," he said, still avoiding her gaze. "We need to verify that you're the account holder before we can process the withdrawal." Clara's patience snapped. She wasn't just any customer. She had been coming here for years. She had opened this very branch. And yet, here she was being interrogated over a transaction that should have taken minutes. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm but ice cold. "I have given you my ID. I have filled out your form. You have my account number. So tell me, Eric, what exactly do you need to verify?" A few customers shifted in the lobby, sensing the confrontation. Natalie Parker's hands froze over the keyboard, her gaze flicking between Eric and Clara, her discomfort palpable. Eric stiffened. He was losing control of the moment. His fingers drummed lightly against the counter before he tried again. "Can you tell me the amount of your last deposit?" he asked, his voice now edged with forced authority. Clara's stomach tightened. There it was, a question meant to trip her up. Something no one else would have been asked. Something designed to prove, yet again, that she didn't belong here. She narrowed her eyes. "That's not standard procedure," she said. Eric shrugged, playing it off. "It's just a way to confirm account security," he said lightly, but there was nothing casual about his tone. Clara's patience was hanging by a thread. "I don't have that number memorized," she said, firm, unwavering. "But you do," she continued, leaning slightly forward. "You have my account pulled up right now, don't you?" Eric's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Clara could see it now. He was stalling because he had made a decision the moment she walked in. He had already decided she was someone to be questioned, that she was someone who didn't belong. that she was not the type of person who could walk into his bank and withdraw her own money without proving herself first, and she was done playing along. She straightened, her shoulders squaring. "Well," she said, her voice cool but commanding, "since you have my account pulled up, you can go ahead and process the withdrawal." Eric hesitated. Then instead of answering, he glanced over at Natalie. "Call security," he said. Clara's stomach dropped. Natalie's face went pale. "Security?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric didn't look at her. "Just standard procedure," he said. A few gasps sounded from the lobby. Customers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly watching. Natalie froze, staring at Eric like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Clara, however, didn't flinch. She let the moment stretch, the tension thickening. Then slowly she reached into her bag. She pulled out her phone, and in front of everyone, she began recording. Natalie let out a small gasp. Eric's head snapped up. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Clara lifted her phone just enough so the camera was facing him directly. "You're refusing to process my withdrawal," she said, her voice even, precise, "even though I have provided all necessary identification." Eric stiffened. "You're escalating this," she continued, "by calling security on a longtime customer who is simply asking for access to her own account." Natalie inhaled sharply, looking between them like she wanted to disappear. Eric swallowed, his confidence cracking. Clara let the silence settle before speaking again. "I wonder," she said smoothly, "if corporate would find this level of scrutiny justified." Eric shifted uncomfortably. More eyes were on him now. He could feel it. The whispers had started, the curious stares, the judgment, and suddenly he realized his mistake. A flicker of panic crossed his face, but Clara didn't let up. "I'll tell you what's going to happen next," she said, her voice calm but razor sharp. "You are going to process my transaction." She took a step closer. "And then," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "you are going to explain to your regional manager why you felt the need to deny a withdrawal, delay a customer, and call security over $5,000. Eric's throat bobbed. Clara didn't blink. "The choice is yours," she finished. Silence. Then, Eric turned without a word, grabbed the form, and stamped the approval. Natalie quickly printed out the receipt and slid it across the counter with shaking hands. Clara picked it up. Then she looked Eric in the eye. "You should remember who I am next time," she said softly. And with that, she turned and walked out, without looking back. Clara Johnson's heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained calm, unreadable. She had seen this playbook too many times before. The slow dismissal, the unnecessary escalation, the subtle but deliberate attempt to make her feel like she didn't belong. But today, she wasn't letting it slide. Eric Simmons stood frozen, his hand still resting on the counter, his eyes darting toward the security guard, now stationed at the entrance. Clara didn't move. Instead, she lifted her phone a little higher, angling it so that it caught everything. The teller's pale face, Eric's clenched jaw, the nervous shifting of customers in the background. She wasn't just recording a video, she was creating evidence. "You're refusing to allow me access to my own account," she said, her voice carrying across the lobby, clear and unwavering. "Even after I've provided government-issued identification, while other customers aren't being asked for anything extra." A murmur rippled through the room. The man standing near the teller's counter glanced between Clara and Eric, his brows furrowing. A woman by the waiting area leaned in slightly, her curiosity shifting into concern. Eric's face lost color. He started, but Clara wasn't finished. She turned the camera slightly, now focusing on the security guard standing nearby. "And you," she said, her voice even but sharp, "you were called over for what reason exactly?" The security guard shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked toward Eric, then back to Clara. "I'm just here to make sure everything goes smoothly," he muttered, his voice uncertain. Clara's eyebrow lifted. "To make sure everything goes smoothly," she repeated, the words laced with cold disbelief. "Or are you here to intimidate me, to make sure I understand my place?" Eric visibly stiffened. The weight of the moment crashed down on the entire room. Customers were watching, employees were watching. Even Natalie, who had stayed silent this entire time, looked like she wanted to disappear. And Clara knew they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. She lowered her phone slightly, but she wasn't done. "You've made a big mistake, Eric," she said smoothly. "A very big mistake." Eric's lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Johnson, if you just calm down." Clara cut him off. "Oh, I'm calm," she said, her voice chillingly even. "But you should be worried." She turned, scanning the room, locking eyes with customers who had now gone from spectators to witnesses. Because this wasn't just about a bank transaction. This was about something much bigger, and everyone in this room would remember it. Eric Simmons straightened his tie, but the stiffness in his posture gave him away. "We just want to ensure a smooth experience for all our customers," he said, his voice too polished, too rehearsed. Clara Johnson tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "A smooth experience," she repeated, her tone laced with quiet disbelief. Eric swallowed hard. "Well, Eric, I'll tell you this. I'm not leaving until you process my withdrawal," Clara continued. "And if you think I'm going to stand here and let you treat me like this, you've got another thing coming." A heavy silence fell over the bank lobby. Customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at one another, others pretending not to hear, but all of them watching. The security guard at the entrance shifted his stance, clearly unsure of what to do next. Clara could feel it, the entire room hanging on her next move. She took a slow, steady breath, then spoke again. "Eric, I'm going to say this one more time," she said, her voice now cool and unwavering. "You're refusing to process a withdrawal from my personal account, despite me providing all the necessary identification. And yet, you've brought in security as though I'm the one causing a scene." Her eyes locked onto his, sharp and unflinching. "And for what? Because of the way I look? Because I'm not dressed in a suit today?" Eric flinched. His mask of professionalism cracked, just slightly. Clara didn't give him time to recover. "I don't want to hear any more excuses," she said, her voice ringing clear across the room. "This isn't about policy. It's about bias." She lifted her phone higher. "This conversation is on record now, Eric," she said, "and everyone in this room is witnessing what's happening." Eric's gaze flicked nervously between Clara, the security guard, and Natalie Parker, who had gone utterly silent behind the counter. It was too late to fix this, and he knew it. Clara took one slow step forward. "I helped build this bank, Eric," she said, her voice now smooth as glass. "I personally approved your job here, and yet despite all of that, you still can't process my withdrawal?" Eric's face drained of color. The realization sank in like a stone. He opened his mouth. No words came out. Clara took a breath. "Let me introduce myself properly," she said. She reached for her ID, still resting on the counter. Slowly, she flipped it over, tapping it against the smooth surface. "You see this?" she said, her voice calm but lethal. "This isn't just any customer's ID." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "This is the founder and CEO of Johnson Banking Group." The realization hit Eric like a brick wall. A hush fell over the lobby. The security guard straightened slightly, no longer sure where he stood in all this. Natalie went pale. Customers exchanged stunned glances. Eric stared at Clara's ID, his fingers shaking slightly. For the first time, he was no longer in control. Clara had taken that power back, and she wasn't stopping now. "I built this bank from the ground up," she said. "I signed off on every budget, every hire, every branch opening." She let her words sink in. "And today I walked in here as just another customer," she continued. "And you treated me like I didn't belong." She let one last silent stretch, watching as Eric grappled with the reality of his actions. Then she gave him a choice. "You can process my transaction," Clara said, her voice razor sharp, "or you can deal with the consequences." Eric's mouth opened and closed, struggling for words, but it was too late. "You had your chance," Clara finished, voice steady, unshaken. She turned to the security guard. "And as for you," she said, cold and direct, "if a customer isn't disruptive, the first response should not be intimidation. You need to be careful about whose instructions you follow." The security guard nodded stiffly, already realizing his mistake. Then Clara turned to Natalie Parker, who had remained silent through the entire ordeal. "And you," Clara said, her voice soft but firm, "you saw my ID. You saw my account number. You knew exactly who I was. And yet, You still decided I wasn't worth listening to. Natalie's face flushed red, her fingers trembling against the keyboard. I, I was just following protocol, ma'am, she whispered. Clara took one last step forward, her voice cutting. Protocol, she repeated. That only seems to apply to people like me? Natalie's mouth opened, but she had no answer. Clara let the silence hang, let the weight of her words sink in. Then she simply turned on her heel. Her steps were slow, deliberate as she strode toward the exit, her head held high. The automatic doors whooshed open, but before she left, she turned one last time. Her eyes locked onto Eric Simmons. You should remember who I am next time, she said. And with that, she walked out. Because from this moment forward, things at Johnson Banking Group were about to change forever. The lesson in this story is clear. Power and privilege should never dictate how people are treated. Clara Johnson walked into her own bank as a regular customer, only to face suspicion, condescension, and blatant bias. Her experience is a stark reminder that discrimination isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's hidden behind policies, procedures, and standard protocols that seem to only apply to certain people. The employees at Johnson Banking Group made a critical mistake. They assumed that Clara was insignificant simply because she wasn't dressed in power, because she didn't fit their preconceived idea of who a bank owner should be. But dignity should never depend on appearances. This story teaches us that respect should be given to everyone, not just those who look the part. Clara's response was not just about getting her money, it was about demanding accountability, exposing bias, and forcing change. She didn't allow intimidation to silence her, and she didn't let their poor treatment slide. Instead, she used her power to ensure that what happened to her would never happen to another customer again. In life, we will all face moments of unfair treatment, whether in the workplace, at a business, or in everyday interactions. But this story reminds us that we must never accept discrimination as normal. When we challenge injustice, when we refuse to stay silent, we force the world to change for the better. So the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, ask yourself, will you stand by and watch, or will you speak up? Because change doesn't just happen. It starts with someone bold enough to demand it. Hit that like button to support stories that expose injustice and demand change. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another eye-opening story that challenges the system and inspires action. Share this video with your friends and family, because the more people who see it, the more awareness we can spread. Drop a comment below. Have you ever faced discrimination like this? Have you seen unfair treatment happen to someone else? Share your experience. Your engagement helps us continue telling these powerful stories and making a real impact. Let's stand together against injustice, because change starts with us.